Book 2. The Dust of 1,000 Men. Chapter 2. Liza Coffin faced into the breeze and closed her eyes, feeling the gentle wind blow over and around her. There was still a hint of cool in the air, the day new and promising, and not yet the furnace it would become, and the sky was high and clear and beautiful, and without a hint of trouble anywhere. She filled her lungs with the good air, which smelled of spring honeysuckle and pear blossoms. It was dawn of a Wednesday, the first day of July, 1863. In the days and weeks to come, Liza would not infrequently close her eyes, breathe deep, and try with all her might to remember this last morning before the soldiers came and the world went to hell. She turned her head to the ground, where lay her baby boy Sam in his basket. She waved a hand at him, said, "Howdy doody, Sammy," in her baby voice, the one she used for him alone, a high-pitched, sugary sweet speak. He smiled up at her, sort of. He was a generally plain-faced baby, just 3 months old, and she hadn't yet decided whether or not he had learned to smile. He pulled up one side of his mouth anyway, and it might just as well have been a smile, she decided. The novelty of having another soul around, let alone her own baby, had not yet worn thin. She had spent so much of her life alone, her parents were gone, and she had no other family, that to have this little bundle seemed to her a daily miracle. "You're lovely, like your pa, and you have his nose." She knelt down and rubbed his hair, laughing at how it stood up with static cling, then reached into the pile of laundry beside him and grabbed a few items. She began to hang these things over the clothesline: cloth diapers, a few blouses, a flower-patterned dress she was particularly fond of, pieces of her underthings, and more. She talked incessantly all the while, with Sam in his basket a captive audience. "Your pa, he'll be home soon." She said this every day, or something very much like it. She had no particular knowledge of his return, rather a deep longing to see him again. "I don't mean today, of course, but soon. I ain't exactly sure on account of him being in the army. Soldiers ain't got a whole lot of time these days on account of the war. But he'll be home. You'll see." Sam made a quizzical little face, like he wanted to ask a question but couldn't think of the right words, and Liza went on, both with her laundry and her talking. "You're such a quiet thing," she said in her baby voice, then back to her own. "I do love your pa, you know. When he comes home, I guess when this killing war is over, we gonna be a family. You'll see, Sammy. You, me, and your pa. I'll introduce you." She smiled at that last, thought, "I hardly know him myself." She was just 17. He was 20 or so. Couldn't remember for sure. Older than she was, but not much. She didn't even know his birthday. They had known each other 6 months, but that was a year ago. Hadn't seen each other since. But it had been an intense 6 months, and sometimes in the night, when her longing for him crossed into a physical need, she would lie with her pillow and believe she could feel the shape of him against her. They were in love. Young love. The kind meant to last a lifetime and then some. Liza, Mrs. Ezra Coffin, she liked to say, because it reminded her she was part of a family now, finished with the laundry. She picked up Sam, kissed him, and he glomped onto her tit. "You hungry, Sam? Go on, take your fill. After breakfast, we got to get that old cow over to the barn. Might be we can get some milk out of her yet. Something to trade." 20 yards behind her cabin, buried in the scrub and thornberry bushes with an entrance all but invisible, was an old root cellar. After milking the old cow, it was a good day, and she gave up the better part of 2 gallons. Liza carried the milk bottles under one arm and Sam under the other. She was on her 3rd trip between the cellar and the barn when the first soldiers came. She dropped the milk. There were 2 of them, dressed in a dirty, slipshod sort of way, wearing what she took to be Confederate uniforms. One of them was shoeless, and she could see the other's toes through the holes in his footwear. They were friendly and too familiar, she thought. They asked did she have anything to eat. "Nothing," she said, hugging Sam close. The one with the holy footwear spat. "That there baby don't look too hungry," he said in a lazy southern drawl. "We got a little milk's all." She didn't like their eyes, how they roamed over her. "In the barn. Where there's milk, there's a cow." "She's old. Don't produce much," Liza said. "She ain't too old for eatin'," the shoeless one said. Liza smirked. "That ain't right." "Well, that's war. Just about the least right thing I ever seen in this life," the shoed man said. The pair left trailing the old cow behind them. Liza stood watching them go. Sam, in her arms, stripped to his diaper as the day was starting to heat up. From across the wheat fields, the irregular sound of repeated gunfire startled her. "They'll be back," she whispered. "Them or others." They marched in the dust of 1,000 men, a hot, dry dust spewing the kind of heat that paws at a man and drains the vigor out of him. These men were the common part of a larger machine, indeed the guts that made that machine work. Privates, corporals, sergeants, junior lieutenants, seasoned captains, majors, and colonels. Soldiers all to a man, they had an undeniable familiarity with the march. The army, to which they were both an insignificant part and the most consequential element, had been ever on the move for 2 years now. This road, and hundreds more like it, bridging the miles between 10,000 different places scattered wide across the nation, was their home. Marching was their stock in trade as much as, if not more than, fighting. For every hour in combat, they endured many more hours on the road. They wore shoes down faster than the cobbler could make them. They slept on the side of the road, ate on the side of the road, relieved themselves at the side of the road. They rarely went where the roads did not, and when circumstances forced them to do just that, they built a road. And so, even with raw throats and feet made leathery by too many miles, they pressed on, as if their bones knew the way of their own accord, as if they'd been born to a world of miserable stepping. Such was a soldier's life. As a certain private in this army watched, a hawk flew high overhead. It soared on some unseen air current, looking graceful and free. The bird grew small in the distant sky until this certain private could no longer pick it out from the other specks of dust. After it was gone, he remarked, "If I was a bird, I'd get on out of here too." This man was a member of E Company, a part of the 115 Pennsylvania, an infantry regiment in the Grand Army of the Potomac, what had once been called the showpiece of the Union Army. But on this day, the last day of June in the year of our Lord, 1863, such a time as that seemed far removed. The rebels had nearly bled the Army of the Potomac to death at Chancellorsville, just 7 weeks past. 6 months before that, this certain private and other members of the 115 Pennsylvania, held in reserve, had watched with a sort of gut-boiling awe as their fellows assaulted the heights above the Rappahannock River no less than 14 times. They had seen that no blood looked quite so red as that silhouetted against new-fallen snow, a massacre in the cold December wind. Such was Fredericksburg. This certain private twisted with the day's heat. A sheen of grubby sweat coated his skin, and he crooked his neck this way and that with the feel of it. All the while, he followed the man in front of him, who in turn followed the man in front of him, who followed the man in front. The land seemed to blight in their wake, to quake under their feet. He choked on the russet dust and spat dirt. Unwashed, he smelled of last week's march, of the burnt ashes of last night's campfire. As he walked, he chewed a half-cooked piece of fatback, ignoring the nothing taste of grease. The straps of his pack dug into his shoulders, but he no longer tried adjusting them. It was a slight discomfort, like a small pebble underfoot. A trifling thing. The better part of a year at war had taught him to ignore trifling things. This certain private's name was Ezra Coffin, and he had no idea where they were going, only from where they had come, a place best forgotten. At Chancellorsville, he'd come across a man he knew slightly from before the fight, Corporal Dalhousie. Dalhousie was from Poughkeepsie and had a wife and 2 daughters. On his arm was a big heart-shaped tattoo with the name Liza in the middle. The private's wife was also named Liza, and so he had admired the tattoo as the two bivouacked. The next day, they'd been standing together when a bullet tore through Dalhousie's elbow, completely separating it at the joint. The glistening, polished bone stuck out like the white-hot glow of embers in the ashes of a dying fire. 2 hours later, the private had recognized that tattoo, half of it anyway, on a heap of flesh beside a big oak. The ground was soaked with blood for 10 feet around the tree, and when he walked across it, his boots slid on the burdened grass. He stared at the arm, at the broken heart and the inked letters on the skin. Za. He thought of his own Liza, of the baby boy he'd never seen, and he conjured that Dalhousie himself, and not the arm, had been amputated. Private Ezra Coffin fixed his eyes on the back of the man in front of him. His legs ached, and he had a need to piss. He spat and took another chew of the fatback and wished for a breeze, even the tiniest breeze. The trees, still heavy with their leaves in late June, did not sway. It occurred to him there was no such thing as perfect weather for marching. Always too hot, or too cold, or too wet, or too dry. Too much of this or too much of that. And so, over a sun-parched, dusty road on the last day of June, in the year of our Lord 1863, Private Ezra Coffin marched along as he had 100 times before. He couldn't know his marching days were just about over. Another army was on the move on a road remarkably similar to the thoroughfare used by the 115th Pennsylvania. Though not quite in the immediate vicinity of each other, the roads were close enough that the vanishing speck of dust seen by one army was an enlarging bird in flight from the vantage point of the second. More precisely, as seen through the field glasses of Major Tom Jersey, the bird was a red-tailed hawk. The major whistled as he saw the soaring wings come into distant focus. He hadn't seen a bird of prey in Northern Virginia in almost a year. Such a bird of prey could mean only one thing: food. Jersey hailed from Kitty Hawk Village, a fishing town on the outer banks of North Carolina. A banker before the war, he was a balding man of slight build who wore wire-frame spectacles and spoke with a thick Carolina drawl. A quiet family man in his mid-30s, the worst day of his life had come not as a soldier, but as a father. Little Tom, his 10-year-old son, had gone fishing one afternoon in the summer of 1860. He had never been seen again. A few months later, a nigger boy walking the back roads of Albemarle Sound, not 2 miles from the major's house, spied a wicker basket in the roadside mud. Inside he found a bit of tackle, the remains of several fish long since rotted, and a smear of muck which might have been fish guts. It was black and crusty, though, and just the exact color of old blood. On the underside of the creel's lid, scrawled in faded, barely legible letters, was the single word, Tom. A search of the creel's hiding place turned up only one other object: a boy's left shoe. It had been a year since Major Jersey had seen the Outer Banks. As second in command of the 18th North Carolina, an infantry regiment in the Army of Northern Virginia, he'd had little time for such visits. Now that regiment, 300 strong, was strung out along the road and raising a billowing cloud of dust in their wake. They had crossed the Potomac a week before, were in the north, enemy territory. They had orders to quickstep it. The battle was joined and men were dying, or soon would be. Replacements were needed. The Hawk came closer now. This north was a bountiful place, with lush green fields and crops aplenty. Jersey stepped aside the column of men and stopped. He took a swig from his canteen, swearing at the drops that trickled down his beard. On a day so hot, water was too precious to waste. The major knew much about waste. The land they'd left across the river, A place most of the soldiers called home and became melancholy about was a wasted land indeed. Picked over by the two armies, whole valleys had been scorched to ash, first by fleeing rebels, then invading Federals, then retreating Federals going back the way they'd come in the first place. In the ruins of northern Virginia, even the chickens were starving. He urged the men forward, holding the canteen high in the air with his arm extended as he did so. "Get on now," he said in his lanky southern drawl. "And mind you drink. It's a hot one, and we ain't got a man to lose. Drink up, you sons of bitches." He ran his eyes up and down the column. "You, Collins, ain't it? Step up there, son. No stragglers today." "I got short legs, sir. Can't hardly keep up," the young soldier said. He showed a wide, crooked-teethed smile as he spoke, and those around him burst into laughter. The rebuked fellow moved up smartly just the same. "Well," the major hollered after him, "I guess you just gonna have to two-step it then." He turned to another, a corporal whose right sleeve hung empty. "Good to see you back, Miller. I thought you was a goner sure." "Ain't no Yankee lad whatever could kill me, sir. This," the stout corporal pointed to his vacant sleeve, "this here's no more'n a flesh wound." And so it went. They were in southern Pennsylvania now, taking the war to the enemy, giving them a taste of what they'd felt for far too long. The major looked out across the countryside and saw rolling green hills as far as he could see, the land broken only by the occasional copse of oak. He thought of his son, as he often did on long marches, and tried to imagine him running through the tall grass. He wondered what the boy, gone these 3 long years, would have looked like today. As was always the case, however, the boy he saw in his mind's eye was the same 10 years old he'd been the morning of his disappearance. And as the hawk soared above him, Jersey had a vision of that boy chasing butterflies in the hills before him, his step uneven. He was missing a shoe. Surgeon Josiah Boyd leaned toward the corner, pressed his tongue against his lips, and spat. Reflex mostly. Something he did without thinking whenever the need presented, which was often. The gob splattered against the wall, joining the smear of juice already there. Assistant Surgeon Tobias Ellis gave little thought to the smear of tobacco, keeping his mind on the task at hand. Like Boyd, his hands and forearms were streaked with the blood of scores of men. They looked raw, almost skinned. "Artery clamp." Boyd stretched a palm out and waiting. Tiny, the surgeon's helper, was a heavy-set kid in his early 20s, though he looked younger. His experience put the lie to his appearance. He'd spent the better part of 2 years, the worst part of a lifetime, with the field hospital. He rummaged in the dirty water of the basin, even as he held a chloroformed mask over the patient's face. His fingers made quick work in the cool, blood-pink water, finding the instrument by feel. He slammed the clamp into Boyd's hand with a sharp smack, and Boyd squeezed the clamp around the femoral artery as Ellis lifted the great vessel out of its bed, the thrum of the pulse fighting back from within. The clamp clicked as it locked, and the artery beyond the obstruction went limp. "Ligature," Boyd said with a practiced calm. Major Josiah Boyd was old for his 38 years. His hair had thinned up top, and he hadn't shaved in days. He was of lanky build and sallow complexion, possessed of a long, drawn-out face almost ghoulish in its particulars, with prominent cheekbones high under his eyes. His lower jaw had been twice broken, once by a horse, once by a man, and poorly set. It jutted obtrusively, and his teeth came together at an angle somewhat off the expected, so that the whole of his face looked skewed. His hands were large and his fingers long and spindly like the legs of a great spider. They were economical in their wanderings across the surgical field, however, with no waste of motion. The soldier on the table lay on his back. He was insensible to the workings both around and upon him, heavy under the influence of a chloroform-soaked towel. Boyd and Ellis worked quickly at their labors, their movements looking somewhat frantic at times. They had about them a look of resigned experience, showing both intolerable exhaustion and an inordinate energy at the same time. They had been working feverishly at one task or another since first light a dozen hours before. Their efforts had made not a dent in the line of men awaiting their services. At times, they worked so fast, and the wounded spent so little time before them, it seemed they were cutting the same man over and over again. Tiny passed the silk ligature, and Ellis encircled the artery twice with it, just above the clamp. His fingers blurred with movement as he tied the thread and occluded the artery. He repeated the exercise on the thinner-walled vein beside it. Tiny retrieved a pair of scissors from the basin and slapped them into Ellis's hand even before the man could ask for them. The assistant surgeon divided the vessels, artery and vein, below the ligatures and removed the clamp. They had cut away the soldier's trousers and filleted his thigh to the bone midway between hip and knee 10 minutes before. Now, with the last of the muscle and flesh parted and only the bare thigh bone joining the lower leg to the upper, the amputation was complete in all but fact. Only the saw cut remained. "Capital saw," Ellis said, and out of his side vision he caught Boyd turning to spit again. This time, he had time to consider the action, something he'd seen Boyd do 1,000 times in a dozen hovels just like this one. In the instant before the handle of the bone saw struck his palm, Ellis wondered at the incongruities of the man who was his direct senior. He had good hands. God damn it, that ain't true, Ellis thought. He's more than that, a genuine, honest-to-God born surgeon. Ellis had seen a lot of men work the tables in his almost 2 years as an assistant surgeon, and Boyd was, hands down, the best cutter out there. But it was also true the man had odd ways, like his want to chew during surgery, which perhaps wasn't all that bad, except it meant he was always spitting. And there was his habit of spacing out in the middle of an operation. He'd suddenly walk away from the table, turn his back to the room, or go behind a wall, then reappear before too long as if nothing had happened. Except something had happened, Ellis would always think. At such times, Boyd looked different. Certainly not better, and not worse, or probably not worse, he'd had occasion to think a few times. And how curious was that? Just different. It showed most in his hands, which looked somehow, he tried to think of the correct word, revitalized? Was that it? Upon returning to the table, those hands, which had seemed worn and tired, would now be spirited and quick to perform. But it was Boyd's eyes that bothered. Once the surgeon reappeared, Ellis always found those eyes unsettling, as if Boyd's eyes had developed an unpleasant lag, a sort of disparity with his hands, as if the one had given to the other, Ellis suddenly thought. He swallowed hard then, tried to put that absurd notion out of his head. A fevered product of his own exhausted mind, he decided. After all, once a battle was joined and the bloodletting began, there was never enough rest. Tiny put the saw in Ellis's palm and he came back to the moment. He curled his fingers around it. They seemed to have conformed to it over the endless months of the war, and went to task on the soldier's femur. Boyd held the meat of the leg out of the way as Ellis laid the business side of the saw against the lower end of the bare thigh bone and began to run it back and forth. The blade's teeth bit at the glistening bone with a gritty feel, and flecks of ivory dust and crimson blood peppered the air as he worked. The sawing took more force than Ellis supposed it should, and he made a mental note to have Tiny replace the blade before the next patient. When he'd about sawn through the hole of the femur, the remnant snapped with the pop of a dry twig and the leg fell away. Tiny stuffed a wad of lint against the bleeding stump as Boyd removed the now useless limb. Bone file. Tiny anticipated the request and passed it without hesitation. Ellis grasped the narrow 5-inch flat metal file and worked the roughened side against the sharp edges of the bony stump. When he was satisfied with the appearance and feel, no sharp edges to work through the skin later, he nodded at Boyd, who took a quick feel as well. "That'll do," the senior man said. Ellis handed the file back to Tiny, and Boyd took up an amputation knife. Its long, sharp edge might easily slice a ham, and carved away a bit of remaining muscle and flesh on the back of the thigh, until he was satisfied with the look and feel of the flap to lay over the stub of bone. They continued to work largely in silence, with no idle chit-chat. Ellis removed the lint from the end of the sawn bone. Satisfied the wound was not oozing too much blood, the surgeons flapped the skin up and approximated the edges with several silk stitches placed an inch apart. Ellis dressed the incision with a plaster cap, and Tiny fanned the man to purge the chloroform from his system. A quick whiff of liquor of ammonia served finally to bring him back to consciousness, whereupon he began to groan. Judging the man was safely over the effects of the chloroform, Boyd dribbled a few drops of laudanum, a sweet concoction of opium and alcohol, on the soldier's tongue to dull him to the agony of the hours to come. Ellis had seen its effect on men time and again. Some the laudanum slept, others it simply relaxed. Ellis himself had taken it once or twice to kill a headache. Its effect had felt something akin to salvation, removing him from the horrors of the field hospital and the tussle of war, albeit transiently. Good stuff, he thought, and dangerous. Too much of that could turn a man out. A pair of stretcher bearers stepped forward and lifted the patient with only a bare afterthought of gentleness, grabbing him under his butt and armpits. The man's grunts as they carried him outside to be deposited alongside the other unfortunates were lost in the chaos of the battlefield hospital. Boyd stood off to one side of the room. Several men interposed between he and Ellis. Ellis watched as the surgeon put his hands out, looking at the trembling, blood-soaked palms as if they might suddenly fall off. Another of Boyd's odd behaviors. There followed a curious moment in which Boyd looked about, spotted Ellis, and slipped awkwardly out the back of the building. Another soldier was placed on the table. As Tiny pressed a cloth over the man's nose and mouth and chloroformed him, Ellis probed the wound in his calf with a stiff finger, feeling for the splinters of bone and the ball that had done the damage. The soldier winced, not quite under yet. As Ellis pulled his finger from the man's innards, Boyd appeared at the side of the assistant surgeon and chuckled in an odd, not at all funny way. The truth of the flesh, he said, or something very much like it. Ellis couldn't be sure. It was a small thing, but as Boyd called for a scalpel, it disturbed Ellis nonetheless, and he had no idea why. My name is Edison McDaniels. Thanks for listening.